The silence that followed Frank's departure was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. My chest tightened as the reality of what had just happened settled in. The words I'd spoken, careless, raw, and unfiltered, now echoed in my mind, each one a dagger to the fragile bond we'd been clinging to for years. Mia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the shift in the air. "Evelyn," she began cautiously, her voice softer now, "do you really mean that? Or is this just frustration talking?" I buried my face in my hands, the heat of shame rising to my cheeks. "I don't know anymore, Mia. Maybe it's both." The truth was, I had meant every word, but not in the way they sounded aloud. It wasn't that Frank was a bad man. He wasn't. He was kind, dependable, and loyal, qualities I once admired deeply. But somewhere along the way, those traits had become overshadowed by the growing chasm between us. We no longer laughed together, shared dreams, or even argued passionately. Our lives had diverged into parallel paths, connected only by habit and obligation. Mia sighed, leaning forward to place a reassuring hand over mine. "You've got to talk to him, Evelyn. Not like this, behind his back, but face to face. If there's something wrong, ignoring it won't fix it." Her advice was logical, but the thought of confronting Frank filled me with dread. How could I explain feelings I barely understood myself? And how could I undo the damage already done? As if on cue, the sound of the front door closing jolted us both. Frank was back. His footsteps echoed through the hallway, deliberate and heavy, before he appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression remained unreadable, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. "Frank," I stammered, standing abruptly, "I didn't realize you were here." He set the grocery bags down on the counter, avoiding eye contact. Clearly, the sharpness in his tone cut deeper than any accusation could have. For a moment, none of us spoke. Mia glanced between us, clearly unsure whether to stay or leave. Finally, she stood, gathering her things. "I should go," she murmured, giving me an apologetic look before slipping out quietly. Once we were alone, the room felt smaller, suffocating. Frank busied himself unpacking the groceries, his movements mechanical. I wanted to say something, anything to bridge the gap, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched him, searching for some sign of what he was feeling. Was he angry, hurt, disappointed, or worse, indifferent? When he finally turned to face me, his eyes were guarded, his jaw tense. "Do you really feel that way about us?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "That I'm not enough for you?" Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. "It's not about you being enough, Frank. It's about us losing ourselves somewhere along the way. I miss who we used to be." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, his gaze piercing yet distant. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the wreckage of our fractured connection. As the hours passed, the house grew quieter, heavier. I replayed the conversation in my head, dissecting every word, every glance. What had started as a cathartic venting session with Mia had spiraled into something far more destructive. And now, I feared it might be too late to salvage what little remained of my marriage. The house felt impossibly empty without Frank. Every room seemed to echo with his absence, as though the walls themselves were mourning what we'd lost, or maybe what I had thrown away. It wasn't just the silence. It was the void he left behind. His toothbrush still sat in its holder by the sink, his favorite mug remained on the counter, and yet none of it felt real. None of it felt like him anymore. I wandered through the rooms aimlessly, picking up objects that belonged to him, a book he'd been reading, a jacket he'd forgotten to take, and holding them close, as if they could somehow bridge the gap between us. But no matter how tightly I clutched these pieces of him, they couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. By the second night, exhaustion weighed heavily on my body, but sleep eluded me. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our argument over and over again. Each word I'd spoken to Mia felt sharper now, more damning. Asterisk, he's not the man I thought he was. Asterisk, had I really believed that? Or had those words been born out of frustration, a fleeting impulse I couldn't reel back in? What hurt most was knowing how unfair I'd been. Frank wasn't perfect. No one was, but he had never stopped trying. Even when I pushed him away, even when I snapped at him or shut him out, he stayed. He showed up. And here I was, lying alone in this cold, silent house, realizing too late how much I took his presence for granted. My mind raced with memories of happier times, lazy Sunday mornings spent sipping coffee together, quiet evenings watching movies side by side, the way he used to hold my hand while we walked down the street. Those moments hadn't disappeared because of some fundamental flaw in who we were. They'd faded because I let them, because somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting for us. But why? When had I become so bitter, so quick to blame him for everything wrong in my life? Was it easier to point fingers than to admit that I was struggling too? That maybe I wasn't the wife he deserved either? As dawn broke on the third day, casting pale light across the bedroom, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not the angry tears of someone lashing out, but the raw, gut-wrenching sobs of someone who knows they've made a terrible mistake. My chest ached with the weight of it all, the guilt, the regret, the fear that I might have ruined the best thing I ever had. And then, amidst the storm of emotions, a fragile clarity emerged. If Frank came back, if he gave me another chance, I would do better. I had to do better. For both of us. Because losing him wouldn't just mean losing a husband. It would mean losing a part of myself. The question was, would he come back? And if he did, would he be willing to forgive me? I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing as if I could form words, but couldn't find any that would suffice. The weight of his statement hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. My mind raced, trying to piece together how we had arrived here, how two people who once loved each other so deeply could now sit across from one another like strangers. Frank, I started finally, my voice trembling. I didn't mean what I said, not like that, not in the way it sounded. He looked at me, then, his gaze steady but distant, as though he were seeing through me rather than truly looking at me. Didn't you? He asked softly, almost more to himself than to me, because it felt real. Evelyn, it felt honest. His calmness unnerved me more than anger ever could have. If he had yelled or accused me, I might have known how to respond. But this quiet certainty, this detached clarity, it left no room for excuses or deflection. He wasn't lashing out. He was simply stating facts, and that made them all the more devastating. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I was frustrated, and I took it out on you, on us. I never wanted to hurt you. Frank sighed, leaning back against the couch. For a moment, he looked tired, so impossibly tired, and it broke my heart in ways I hadn't anticipated. This man, who had always been my rock, my constant, seemed worn down by years of carrying the burden of our fractured relationship alone. You don't get it, do you? He said after a pause, his voice tinged with sadness rather than anger. It's not about whether you meant those words or not. It's about the fact that they're true for both of us. We've been living like ghosts in this house, going through the motions without actually connecting. And I can't keep doing that anymore. The honesty in his voice cut deeper than any accusation ever could. He wasn't wrong. Everything he said resonated painfully within me because I knew it was true. Somewhere along the way, we had stopped being partners and started becoming passengers in each other's lives. So what does this mean? I asked, my voice barely audible. Are you leaving? He hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee, a rare sign of uncertainty from him. "Not yet," he said finally, "but I think we need time apart. Time to figure out what we really want, not just from each other, but from ourselves." The thought of him walking away, even temporarily, felt unbearable. Panic bubbled up inside me, sharp and suffocating. "And if I don't want that?" I blurted out, surprising even myself. "If I want to fix this, to make things right." For the first time since he'd returned, Frank's expression softened slightly. There was a flicker of something there, hope, maybe, or longing, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Then prove it," he said quietly. "Show me that you're willing to fight for us. Because right now, Evelyn, I don't feel like we're fighting for the same thing." His words settled over me like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at my feet. I realized then that this wasn't just about apologies or promises. It was about action, about showing him and myself that I was capable of change. "I will," I said, my voice steadier now. "I'll do whatever it takes." Frank nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. "Okay," he said simply, "we'll see." As he stood and walked toward the kitchen, I sat frozen in place, the enormity of what had just happened crashing over me. This wasn't the end, not yet, but it was a crossroads, a chance to either rebuild what we had lost or let it slip away forever. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. Whatever it took, I wouldn't let him go without a fight. The weight of his words hit me like a freight train, leaving me breathless and unsteady on my feet. I stood there in the dim light of the hallway outside his apartment, tears streaming down my face, feeling more exposed than I ever had before. For weeks, I'd been consumed by guilt. Guilt for letting things fall apart. Guilt for not seeing how lonely he'd become. Guilt for being so blind to what mattered most. And now, standing here, watching him look at me with that mixture of exhaustion and resolve, I felt it all crashing down around me, holding each other back. I echoed, my voice trembling. "Is that really what you think?" Frank leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't answer immediately, but the silence spoke volumes. Finally, he said, "I don't know anymore, Evelyn." Maybe we've been doing that for longer than either of us wants to admit. His honesty stung, cutting deeper than any accusation could have. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was sadness, resignation, maybe even regret. But beneath it all, there was something else, clarity, a kind of clarity I hadn't allowed myself to see until now. "I never meant to hurt you," I whispered, shaking my head as if saying it out loud would somehow make it true. I got lost in everything, in work, in my own frustrations, in us or the lack of us. And I didn't realize how much I was shutting you out until it was too late." Frank's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "You're not the only one who got lost, Evelyn. I stopped fighting for us too. Somewhere along the way, I gave up trying to reach you because it felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough." His admission caught me off guard, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just about me failing him. It was about both of us failing each other. We'd let the distance grow, brick by brick, until the wall between us was insurmountable. The realization made my knees weak, and I gripped the doorframe for support. "But I'm here now," I said desperately, stepping closer. "I'm here, Frank. I see it now. I see everything I did wrong, and I want to fix it. Please, just tell me how." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze searching mine as if trying to gauge whether I truly meant what I was saying. Then he sighed again, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as one of frustration, of weariness. "It's not that simple, Evelyn. You can't just flip a switch and undo years of neglect. Trust doesn't come back overnight." "I know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But I'm willing to try. to do whatever it takes. Just please don't walk away from me completely. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a softening of the walls he'd built around himself. But then it was gone, replaced by that same guarded expression he'd worn since moving out. I need time, he said finally, time to figure out what I want, what we want, if there's even still in us worth saving. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I wanted to argue, to beg him to reconsider, but deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't something that could be fixed in a single conversation or a desperate plea. It was going to take time and effort from both of us. I understand, I said quietly, though every fiber of my being screamed in protest. Just promise me you won't give up on us entirely. Frank hesitated, then nodded once. I won't, but you have to promise me something too. Anything, I said without hesitation. Promise me you'll stop running, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Stop running from yourself, from your feelings, from the hard conversations. Because if we're going to have any chance at fixing this, we both need to show up, fully, not halfway. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I nodded, the weight of his request settling over me. He was asking for more than just promises. He was asking for vulnerability, for honesty, for the courage to face the parts of myself I'd buried for far too long. And for the first time in years, I realized I owed it to him and to myself to try. As I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time, memorizing the way he looked standing there in the doorway. There was pain in his eyes, yes, but also strength, resilience, hope, perhaps buried beneath layers of hurt. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't lose him, not without a fight. The weight of my realizations pressed down on me, heavy and unrelenting, as I sat alone in the quiet house. The darkness felt suffocating, yet it also mirrored the storm inside me, a swirl of guilt, regret, and determination. My mind kept circling back to Frank's words. Asterisk, are we just holding each other back? Asterisk, they echoed like a haunting refrain, forcing me to confront truths I'd buried beneath layers of excuses and self-pity. I thought about all the moments when I could have chosen differently, when I could have reached out instead of retreating, listened instead of lashing out, or simply stayed present instead of letting myself drift away. How many times had I dismissed Frank's attempts to connect because they didn't align with what I wanted? How often had I criticized him for things that were ultimately inconsequential, masking my own insecurities with frustration? And then there were the silences, the ones I'd let stretch too long, the ones where neither of us spoke but so much went unsaid. Those silences hadn't been neutral. They'd been corrosive, eating away at the foundation of our relationship until it felt fragile and unstable. But instead of addressing them, I'd ignored them, pretending everything was fine while resentment festered beneath the surface. For years, I'd told myself I was doing everything I could, that I was the one trying to hold us together while Frank remained distant. But now, sitting here in the stillness, I saw how wrong I'd been. It wasn't that Frank hadn't cared. It was that I'd stopped giving him a reason to stay close. I'd pushed him away without even realizing it, blaming him for the distance I'd created. Tears streamed down my face as I allowed myself to feel the full weight of these truths. Vulnerability wasn't something I was used to. It scared me, exposed me, but I knew it was necessary. If I wanted any chance of repairing what we'd lost, I couldn't keep hiding behind walls of defensiveness and denial. I needed to be honest, not just with Frank, but with myself. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who fell in love with Frank all those years ago. She was softer, more open, less afraid of being hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd hardened, convinced that protecting myself meant keeping others at arm's length. But in doing so, I'd shut out the very person who mattered most. If I wanted Frank back, if I wanted us back, I had to become someone new, someone willing to take risks, to apologize sincerely, to listen deeply. Someone who wouldn't run from difficult conversations or shy away from emotional intimacy. It wouldn't be easy, change never is, but it was the only way forward. As dawn began to break, casting faint light through the windows, I made a silent vow to myself. I would do whatever it took to rebuild what we'd lost, not because I owed it to Frank, but because I owed it to myself. I deserved a marriage built on trust, communication, and mutual respect, and so did he. But first, I had to prove that I was ready to meet him halfway, that I was willing to fight for us, not out of obligation, but out of love. The road ahead would be uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Change starts with awareness, and tonight, I finally understood the role I'd played in our unraveling. Now it was up to me to rewrite the story, to choose connection over isolation, courage over fear, and growth over stagnation. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't give up without a fight. The touch of his hand on my shoulder was light, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. It wasn't the firm, confident gesture I remembered from years ago. It was something softer, more measured, a reminder that we were still finding our footing with each other. I know this isn't easy for you, I said after a moment, my voice trembling slightly, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I want to earn it from you and from myself. Frank nodded slowly, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead of us as we walked along the winding path through the park. The leaves crunched beneath our feet, the crisp autumn air carrying the faint scent of earth and wood smoke. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like space, room for both of us to breathe without the pressure of expectations or demands. "You're not the only one who needs to change," he admitted finally, his tone thoughtful. "I've been holding on to things too. Resentments I didn't even realize until recently." His words caught me off guard. In all my efforts to fix what had broken between us, I hadn't considered how much Frank might have been carrying silently within him. Guilt flickered in my chest, sharp and sudden, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about understanding. "What kind of resentments?" I asked carefully, keeping my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup he still held. "Little things, mostly, like how you used to shut me out when you were stressed, or how I always felt like I was walking on eggshells trying not to upset you. And then there were bigger things, like feeling like I wasn't enough for you." The honesty in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. Each word landed with precision, cutting through the layers of denial I'd built up over the years. He wasn't accusing me. He was simply stating facts, truths that had festered beneath the surface of our relationship for far too long. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I never meant to make you feel that way." "I know," he said quickly, shaking his head. "And maybe I should have said something sooner instead of letting it build up. We both played a part in this, Evelyn. That's why it's going to take both of us to fix it." His acknowledgement of shared responsibility brought a strange sense of relief. For so long, I'd shouldered the blame alone, convinced that everything wrong in our marriage was entirely my fault. Hearing Frank admit his own struggles made me feel less isolated, less like the sole architect of our pain. We continued walking, the conversation ebbing and flowing like the gentle breeze, rustling the trees above us. There were moments of laughter, small, fleeting glimpses of the connection we used to share, as well as stretches of quiet reflection. By the time we reached the edge of the park, the sun was beginning its descent, casting golden hues across the horizon. "This feels good," Frank said suddenly, breaking the silence. His expression was soft, almost wistful. "Different, but good." "It does," I agreed, managing a small smile despite the lump still lodged in my throat. "Doesn't mean it's easy, though." "No," he said, his lips curving into a faint grin. But nothing worth having ever is. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope, not the reckless, desperate kind, but a cautious optimism rooted in the belief that we could find our way back to each other. It wouldn't happen overnight, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way. But standing there beside Frank, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. As we parted ways that evening, Frank gave me a quick hug, a brief, tentative embrace that left me yearning for more. Yet even in its brevity, it carried a promise, a chance to rebuild, to rediscover the love that had once bound us together. Driving home, I replayed the day's events in my mind, savoring the moments of connection we'd shared. Progress was slow, uncertain, and often painful, but it was progress nonetheless. And for now, that was enough. The simplicity of that moment, his hand in mine, the quiet certainty in his voice, felt like a promise, not just to each other, but to ourselves. For so long, we had been two people living parallel lives under the same roof, connected by habit rather than intention. But now there was something different between us, an unspoken understanding that this time we were choosing each other with eyes wide open. It wasn't perfect. How could it be? Rebuilding trust is messy work, full of missteps and second-guessing. There were days when old wounds resurfaced, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the fragile peace we'd built. Arguments still flared up over things that seemed trivial on the surface: a forgotten chore, a missed phone call, but beneath them lay deeper fears and insecurities. One particularly tense evening, after a disagreement about finances spiraled into a heated exchange, I found myself standing in the kitchen, tears streaming down my face. Frank stood across from me, his jaw clenched, frustration etched into every line of his face. "I'm trying," I said, my voice breaking. "But sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment I thought he might walk away. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression softening. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "And maybe I haven't been fair either. I've been holding on to things too, expecting you to read my mind instead of telling you how I feel." His words caught me off guard. Vulnerability from Frank was rare. He had always been the strong, stoic one, the one who kept his emotions locked away. Seeing him let his guard down, even just a little, made me realize how much he was risking by giving us another chance. "I don't want to fight anymore," I whispered, reaching out hesitantly. My fingers brushed against his, and he didn't pull away. I want us to be okay. "We will be," he said firmly, taking my hand in his. "But it's going to take both of us. No shortcuts. No pretending everything's fine when it's not." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "No shortcuts," I echoed. That night, as we sat together at the kitchen table, we talked, really talked for the first time in years. We laid bare our fears, our regrets, our hopes for the future. It wasn't easy. There were moments when my chest tightened with shame or anger threatened to boil over. But we stayed. We listened. And slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild the bridge that had crumbled between us. As the weeks turned into months, small changes started to take root. Frank began leaving notes for me on the counter, little reminders of grocery items or sweet messages that made me smile. I made an effort to ask him about his day, to truly listen instead of nodding absent-mindedly while scrolling through my phone. We started cooking dinner together again, laughing over burnt garlic bread and spilled sauce. These moments weren't grand gestures, but they mattered. They reminded us why we had fallen in love in the first place. Of course, there were setbacks, times when doubt crept in, whispering insidious thoughts in the dead of night. What if we couldn't fix this? What if we were trying too hard to force something that was already broken beyond repair? On those nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if we were making a mistake. But then morning would come, and Frank would kiss me goodbye before heading to work, or he'd bring me coffee in bed on a lazy Sunday, and I'd remember why we were fighting for this. Love isn't just about the big, sweeping declarations. It's about showing up day after day, even when it's hard. One afternoon, as we worked side by side in the garden planting new flowers, Frank paused and wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. He said, "This feels real, like we're actually doing something that matters." I smiled, brushing dirt from my fingertips. Yeah, it does. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together. Not because we were perfect, but because we were willing to try, willing to grow, willing to choose each other again and again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the yard, I leaned into Frank's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that we could find our way back to each other, not as the people we used to be, but as the people we were becoming. Together. Looking back, I realize how close we came to losing each other completely. There were moments when the chasm between us felt insurmountable, like two ships passing in the night, tethered only by memories of what once was. But somehow, against all odds, we found our way back to one another, not as the people we used to be, but as the people we had become through struggle and self-discovery. Our marriage wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was ours. And in fighting for it, we rediscovered the love that had brought us together in the first place. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that relationships require effort from both sides. Love isn't just a feeling, it's an action, a choice you make every single day. Neglecting your partner's emotional needs isn't just selfish, it's destructive. For so long, I convinced myself that my silence, my withdrawal was harmless, even justified. But now I see how wrong I was. Every unspoken word, every ignored emotion chips away at the foundation of trust and connection. Yet, despite the mistakes we made, I've come to understand something profound. It's never too late to turn things around, as long as you're willing to put in the work. The journey hasn't been easy. It's required vulnerability, honesty, and a willingness to confront truths I'd rather have avoided. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when doubt crept in and whispered that maybe we were trying too hard to fix something beyond repair. But then I'd look at Frank, the man who stood beside me, flaws and all, and remember why I fell in love with him in the first place. He believed in us, even when I didn't. And slowly, I began to believe too. As I sit here writing this, I feel a sense of peace I haven't felt in years. The kind of peace that comes not from perfection, but from acceptance. Acceptance of our imperfections, our struggles, and the messy, beautiful reality of loving someone deeply. Frank and I aren't the same people we were when we first met, and maybe that's a good thing. We've grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient together. We've weathered storms that could have torn us apart. And in doing so, we've built something far more enduring than mere infatuation or convenience. There's a quote I read recently that resonated with me. A strong relationship doesn't mean you'll never fight. It means you'll always choose each other, even after the hardest battles. That's exactly what Frank and I have done. We've chosen each other over and over again, even when it would have been easier to walk away. And while I know challenges will still come because life is unpredictable and messy, I no longer fear them because I know we'll face them together. For the first time in a long time, I believe we have a future worth fighting for. Not because everything is perfect, but because we've proven to ourselves that we're capable of growth, forgiveness, and renewal. We've learned to listen, not just to each other's words, but to the silences between them. To notice the small gestures, the quiet sacrifices, The ways we show up for each other without fanfare or expectation. Those are the moments that matter most, the ones that remind me why we started this journey in the first place. I think about the early days sometimes, when love felt effortless and uncomplicated. Back then, I thought happiness depended on finding the right person. Now I know better. Happiness depends on being the right person for yourself and for the one you love. It's about showing up even when it's hard, about choosing kindness over pride, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. So here we are, standing on the brink of whatever comes next. The road ahead won't always be smooth, but I'm not afraid anymore, because I've seen what we're capable of, and I trust that no matter what happens, we'll continue to grow, not just as partners, but as individuals, together yet separate, whole yet intertwined. And for now, that's enough.